Good evening. Welcome to the Mighty Nettles podcast. Today we are going to dive deep into the Malcolm X theory. We're going to see, was Malcolm X good or bad for the civil rights movement? We're going to explain how he went about getting the best outcome for his community, whether people like it, whether people like the outcome and how he did things. We're going to see was it good or bad for the civil rights movement. To start it off, we have to explain who is Malcolm X. His original name is Malcolm Little. Muslim name is El Shabazz. He was born on May 19, 1925, Omaha, Nebraska, United States. Died February 21st, 1965 in New York. An African American leader and prominent figure in the Nation of Islam, who concepts of race pride and black nationalism in the early 1960s. After his assassination, the widespread distribution of his life story. So, some may say that Malcolm X was trying to find the right word. Some may say Malcolm X was too straightforward or too rural or too rude. And my opinion is that he just was a strong black African leader who wanted the best for his community by any means necessary. It's one of his favorite quotes. By any means necessary. It was a great quote from him, which meaning he's want to get freedom and get equal opportunity for his community by any means necessary. But let's go in a deep dive of who Malcolm X is and where he's from and how he grew up. Let's go in a deep dive of who Malcolm X really is. Born in Nebraska while an infant, Malcolm moved with his family to Lansing, Michigan. When Malcolm was 6 years old, his father, the Reverend Earl Little, a Baptist minister and former supporter of the early black nationalism leader Marcus Garvey, died after being hit by a streetcar, quite possible the victim of murder by whites. The surviving family was so poor that Malcolm's mother, Louise Little, resorted to cooking dandelion greens from the streets to feed her children. After she was committed to insane in 1939, Malcolm and his siblings were sent to foster homes or to live with family and members. Malcolm excelled in school, but after one of his 8th grade teachers told him that he should become a carpenter instead of a lawyer, he lost interest and soon ended his formal education. As a rebellious youngster, Malcolm moved from the Michigan State Detention Home, a juvenile home in Mason, Michigan, to Roxbury section of Boston to live with his older half-sister Ella from his father's first marriage. There he became involved in petty criminal activities in his teenage years, known as Detroit Red. For the reddish tinge in his hair, he developed into a street hustler, drug dealer, and leader of a gang of thieves in Roxbury and Harlem in New York City. While in prison for robbery from 1946 to 1952, he underwent conversations that eventually led him to join Nation of Islam, an African-American movement that combined the elements of Islam with black nationalism. His decision to join the Nation also was influenced by discussions with his brother, who had become a member in Detroit, who was incarcerated with Malcolm in the Norfolk Prison Colony in Massachusetts in 1948. Malcolm quit smoking and gambling and refused to eat pork, and keeping with the nation dietary restrictions. In order to educate himself, he spent long hours reading books in prison's library, even memorizing a dictionary. He also sharpened his skills by participating in debate classes. Following traditions, he replaced his surname Little with an X, a custom among Nation of Islam followers who considered their family names to have originals with white slaveholders. So now that we know some background information on Malcolm X, was Malcolm X good or bad for civil rights? But before we go into deep on that discussion, let's talk about what is the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement was a nonviolent social movement and campaign from 1954 to 1968 in the United States to abolish legalized racial segregation, discrimination throughout the United States. The movement had its origins in Reconstruction eras during the late 19th century, although it made its largest legislative gains in the 1960s after years of direct actions and grassroots protests. The social movement major nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience campaigns eventually secured new protections in federal law for the civil rights of all Americans. The civil rights movement. The face of the civil rights movement was Martin Luther King Jr., and he was for nonviolence, and he wanted peaceful protests, and he didn't want black people to retaliate back against the police when the police. He didn't want it. I would say Malcolm. I would say Martin. He wanted a peaceful protest. Instead, Malcolm wanted us to protect ourselves by any means necessary. That's where that quote comes from. So they was on two different sides, but they had the same goal of protecting black people. It's just one was nonviolent and one was, I'm going to protect myself by any means necessary. So Malcolm X was a minister, a leader in the civil rights movement, and a supporter of the black nationalism. He urged his followers, black Americans, to protect themselves against white aggressions by any means necessary, a stance that often put him at odds with the nonviolent teachings of Martin Luther King. According to an article named American Experiences, Same Problem, Different Directions, it states that near the end of his life, Malcolm X publicly recognized that Dr. King wants the same thing I want, freedom. But for the most of his ministry, he did not identify with King and the civil rights movement, although both black Muslims and King Southern Christian Leadership Conference had the same general goals of defeating white racism and empowering African Americans. Malcolm and King had different tending to speak at different venues, street corners versus churches, and had different aims. Malcolm, who will publicly deny that he was an American, worked for a nation of Islam that sought to create a separate society for its members. Malcolm rejected integrations with white America as a worthwhile aim, and particularly opposed nonviolence as a means of attaining it. That what you mean by nonviolence, he said, be defenseless. In Michael's mind, the African Americans could never surrender his rights or self-defense against white violence. So when we come to a conclusion of whether Malcolm X was good or bad for the civil rights movement, in my opinion, I believe he was good. I believe he gave a different point of view of it, because one leader was trying to do nonviolence. But then again, you can't say Malcolm X was trying to be violence. He just was trying to protect himself. He didn't believe in a nonviolent, he didn't believe in the police and the white people coming to beat on us as a community, and all we trying to do is protest and do better for us. So Malcolm X's point of view of things was he basically wasn't trying to get beat up on. He was trying to protect himself and trying to self-defense by any means necessary. So if you ask me, I believe he was good for the cause, but some may say he was violent and his way was bad for it, when all he was trying to do was self-defense. And self-defense might cause war, but at this point, if we continue to keep getting beat up on just for no reason, where's the growth in that? Some people died in those protests. Some people got up beat real bad to where they got beat to death from those polices and those protests. And Martin Luther King was promoting nonviolence. So Martin Luther, not to take nothing away from Martin Luther King, he was great for the nonviolence movement, and the protests actually had got us somewhere with him being with the nonviolent. But in my opinion, I believe I would have went with Malcolm X's way point of view of things if I was born or alive back then, just for the simple fact that he was trying to protect us and trying to protect the African Americans from dying, because people really was dying in those protests. People was getting beat up bad, and they had promoted the nonviolence. So people say Malcolm X is violence and he was rude and he was ruthless, but I say Malcolm X was smart, intelligent, and he knew exactly what he was talking about in self-defense.
Where our rank on this earth to be a man, to be a human being, to be respected as a human being, to be given the rights of a human being in this society, on this earth, in this day, which we intend to bring into existence by any means necessary.